On today's episode, I'll be talking about the 1995 film Apollo 13.
If you're looking for a man with no plans or programs, and he always leaves a chance to hold hands for romance. Are you looking for the Luke with an old man, a cold hands? It's a creature of the night who heads for his spotlight. I'm here to welcome you to Brandon at Random Reviews. No method when I choose. It's Brandon at Random Reviews. Yeah.
All right, everyone. Welcome to Brandon at Random Reviews, covering one unsystematically chosen topic at a time. If you like listening to a guy recap and review movies in weekly episodes, then look no further. To keep up with the newest content, you can find Brandon at Random Reviews on most major video and audio platforms, as well as all popular social media sites. If you enjoy this, please like and subscribe. As I mentioned, today's movie is Apollo 13, based on real-life events as told in the book Lost Moon by Jim Lovell and Jeffrey Kluger, released on June 30th, 1995, with a runtime of 140 minutes. This movie is rated PG by the Motion Picture Association of America. Budget, $52 million. Directed by Ron Howard, who also directed Cocoon, which if I recall correctly, is a movie about senior citizens who get abducted by aliens from like a retirement community. And that's one of those ones, I've seen it, I enjoyed it quite a bit, but it was one of those ones that isn't on digital. You can't buy it or rent it anywhere, and you can't stream it anywhere. It's just not available. Something with the movie rights is not, doesn't allow for that. And that's only like applied to a handful of movies in the world that are like popular. He also directed A Beautiful Mind with Russell Crowe and an always crush-worthy Jennifer Connelly. And I enjoyed that movie okay, but it's got a lot of surrealism and like dream sequence type things going on in it. And it's just not a movie I want to watch a bunch. I liked it okay. It's just, it is what it is. And he also directed a movie called Far and Away with Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman, but I've never gotten around to watching that one. I'm to gather that it's actually a movie my sister is a huge fan of, but I've just never watched it yet, and I'd really like to. For the writers, we have William Broyles Jr., who also wrote Castaway, which also stars Tom Hanks. And that one's pretty fucking solid. Again, not one I want to watch a ton, but it's very interesting. And it's basically about this guy that gets stranded on an island, and it's very crazy because he's there for like years and he has to learn to survive. He also wrote Flags of Our Fathers, which is a Clint Eastwood movie, and I've never seen it. I've seen Letters from Iwo Jima, and honestly, if I gather that these two have to be similar, or at least they seem like they would be similar, and I just can't bring myself to do it. Like, I don't mind Clint Eastwood, but he is notorious for having like a slowly paced, often labeled as boring movie. And if you couple that with the depressingness of war, it's like, I don't want to watch a movie that's about that or that has that kind of tone. And he also wrote a childhood favorite of mine called Entrapment, because I loved Sean Connery when I was younger, and because he was James Bond, and he was like my favorite James Bond, even though that was pretty well before my time when he was James Bond. And it also has Catherine Zeta-Jones. She is like, I guess you would also call the lead in that movie. Like it's basically two lead roles in that movie. And I was in love with Catherine Zeta-Jones when I was younger as well, especially in the movie The Mask of Zorro. Really enjoyed her. She's very beautiful. I still have quite the crush on her, but just not as significantly because the internet is such a vast place that I can, crush on so many different women. And then the other writer is Al Reinert, who also wrote, and I had a really hard time with his IMDb. Like, I couldn't find anything that really stuck out as relevant, and I almost didn't mention anything, but he wrote Final Fantasy The Spirits Within, and that is a computer animated movie based on a popular video game series. I've never played those games, but I gather that they are very well regarded in the gaming community, especially Final Fantasy VII. I couldn't tell you for sure which console they started on. I mostly, once N64 and PlayStation came along, that was when I really got into video games. But before that, I couldn't tell you if maybe it was on Sega Genesis or Sega Saturn or any of the Nintendo systems before that. For the composer of the score, we have James Horner, who also did the score for The Land Before Time, which is a great movie that I intend to cover actually very soon. I didn't even realize there was that connection between the two before I elected to cover both of them. So I won't get into that movie because I will cover it very soon and I don't want to go crazy talking about it. He also did the score for Field of Dreams, which is a baseball movie starring Kevin Costner and James Earl Jones. It's a very well regarded baseball movie. One of, like, basically probably the top of the list for most people with baseball movies, up there with like The Natural and maybe The Sandlot, things like that. But it is funny to me because James Earl Jones is also in The Sandlot. And so it's like he's in these two really prolific baseball movies. And the story is that James Earl Jones doesn't actually like baseball. Like, he's not a fan of the sport. He likes other sports, but not baseball. I find that great. And that's just hilarious to me. And James Horner also did the score for the movie Titanic, which, of course, I'm sure his score is overshadowed pretty heavily in that movie by Celine Dion's music. So I almost feel bad for the guy, but also that's one of the most popular movies of all time. And he probably made some pretty big bank on it, so I don't feel that bad. And he had already had a pretty successful career, so it's not like he was trying to make a name for himself and then that happened and fucked him over or something. For the cast, we have Tom Hanks, who plays Jim Lovell, and of course everybody knows Tom Hanks. He's an American icon, a national treasure, if you will. He was in the movie Big. That was kind of his breakout role. It was a comedy. He plays this character that it's a kid who wishes to be an adult, and basically it happens overnight. He becomes an adult, and Tom Hanks is that adult, but he's still very much got the mind and personality of a child. And so that is played up to a lot of comedic effect. It's a really enjoyable movie. It's been a while since I've watched that one, but it's a really solid movie. He was also, of course, in Forrest Gump, which is an all-time great movie. I don't really care what people have to say negative about it. I still love the movie because I went so long because I loved Forrest Gump when I was younger, and I still do. And it wasn't until the internet became such a thing that I got to hear all of these negative, critical reviews of Forrest Gump. I had never heard people say bad things about it. I thought it was like universally loved, but there are a lot of whiny, complaining things about it. But it's a really great movie, and Tom Hanks is phenomenal in it. And he was also in the movie Philadelphia with Denzel Washington, and that one is a really good movie. It's a great performance by Tom Hanks, of course, but he plays a gay man who gets AIDS and is wrongfully fired by his employer, and he basically takes his employer to court, and Denzel Washington plays his attorney. Very fucking good movie. Not one you're gonna want to watch every day or something because it's pretty depressing also, but it is what it is. Bill Paxton plays Fred Hayes, which is spelled Haise, not Hayes. And he was, of course, in Twister, which is one I previously covered on this podcast. It was in one of my early video episodes, and my sister actually got mad at me because I didn't include her in that episode. But it's tough for me to know what movies are going to be ones that my sister would really want to be a part of. And so I also feel weird reaching out to her every time I think she might want to do a movie. And so it's really got to be like a movie that I know for sure I could not do without her. Like, for instance, the ones that I've covered before that are just like childhood notorious favorites that we watched all the time. He was also in Aliens, and Aliens is a great fucking movie. It's a very interesting sequel to Alien, which was directed by Ridley Scott. The sequel, Aliens, was directed by James Cameron, and he basically revamped the franchise and made the sequel more of an action movie. It's got a different tone, all that kind of stuff. And he kind of actually did the same thing. I kind of liken it to the original original Terminator and Terminator 2, I think of the first Terminator as being more of a horror movie and the sequel being more of an action movie, even though both have elements of action and horror in them. It is what it is, but I really love Aliens. He was also in True Lies in a strange, smaller role, but I really enjoy him. I enjoy his character in that movie. Also, another one that I covered early in my first few video episodes. Kevin Bacon plays Jack Swigert, and he was also in Footloose. And I always struggle because I really love Footloose, but to explain the premise of Footloose to anyone who doesn't know about it, they kind of find it insane, but it's a really fucking good movie. It's about a town that basically there is some kind of drunken accident with teenagers years before the events of the movie, and they ban dancing and music in like this very misguided reaction to this event where these teenagers died. He was also in Hollow Man, which to this day I have never seen. I've always heard such mediocre things about it, but it's also one of those ones that I always heard about as a kid because there is this scene where Kevin Bacon is invisible and he is like undressing this woman. And so there's this nude scene in the movie. And of course, this movie came out when I was probably like, 13 maybe? I don't remember what year it was specifically, but I was that age where it was just like, oh, boobs, how exciting. And he was also in Tremors, which is a really cool movie set in the desert about these creatures that live underground that they begin attacking people and things like that. And I think Kevin Bacon originally wasn't excited to be in it, but he like needed the money or something. And then he later said that he really was happy that he was in that movie and it was a lot of fun and all that stuff. Gary Sinise plays Ken Mattingly, and he was also in Forrest Gump. He plays Lieutenant Dan. And like I said, love Forrest Gump. He's particularly great in that movie. And he shows a lot of range and he's just fucking great. I love Gary Sinise. He was also in the movie Ransom. I want to say he's a bad guy in that movie. And I need to go actually watch Ransom all the way through. I don't think I've seen it beginning to end before, and that would be an interesting one, I think, to cover. Maybe even this season. I don't know. It depends on what else I have lined up. And he was also in CSI New York as the lead of that show, and I never really got into the spin-offs of CSI. I really liked the original CSI, and for those of you who are fans of the show, a lot of people probably feel the same way as I did, where there was a character named Gilbert Grissom, I think Gil Grissom, and he was the lead of the show originally, and he was played by William Peterson, I can't remember. He was great. He was a really cool, interesting character, and when he left the show just never was good as good as it was before. And so that's kind of where, and also these other shows, it's like CSI New York starred David Caruso, and he's notoriously polarizing and pretty well disliked by a lot of people. And his character was also ridiculous. And then CSI New York, it was like Gary Sinise couldn't keep my attention based on what was happening in that show because it just didn't bring enough to it. There were too many fucking shows like that already set in New York, and it wasn't interesting to me. And what was cool about the first CSI was it was set in Las Vegas, so that kind of added some coolness to it. Ed Harris plays Gene Kranz, and he was in The Rock. He was the villain in The Rock, and he is the guy that is a former military guy who sets up a base on Alcatraz Island and basically is just like holding the nation ransom. I love him in that. He plays a great villain. Even though he is capable of playing a non-villain role, I do think he's at his very best when he's a villain. And he was also in Snowpiercer with Chris Evans. And honestly, I really like that movie. I like the concept. It's a really interesting idea. They made it into a TV show years after the movie was popular. And I think maybe it's based on like a graphic novel, but I honestly can't remember. And he was also in A History of Violence with Viggo Mortensen. And honestly, a movie that blew me away when I first saw it because it was so interesting. And I want to say that's a Cronenberg, like a David Cronenberg movie. Can't remember for sure, and I'm not going to look it up. But that's the weird thing is like, that's one of those movies that as soon as I watched that movie, and I would have been, I don't remember what year it would have been, but it had been out for a while and I wanted to get it immediately. And I find it funny that now that I've become more of an enthusiastic physical media collector, and I've even gotten back into like collecting VHSs, I have found that that is considered like one of the holy grails of the VHS community because it's so rare because it came out after VHSs were already falling out of popularity. So you could, if you found a VHS copy of A History of Violence online or like in a thrift store, I should say, you could probably get a lot of money for it. It is probably worth quite a bit. Last but not least, Kathleen Quinlan plays Marilyn Lovell, who is Tom Hanks's character Jim Lovell's wife. She was in Twilight Zone, the movie, which was shrouded in controversy. It's arguably, at least for me, more popular for the controversy that it created than actually as a movie. I remember trying to watch it before I had even heard anything else about it because I was really into Twilight Zone, the original series, and it just didn't have the right tone for me. But basically, there was a bunch of stuff that happened behind the scenes. Actors, including child actors, died because they didn't follow the rules, and then they actually like basically stiffened up the standards for child actors and special effects and things because there was this Vietnam sequence in the movie where basically the effects shot with a helicopter resulted in the death of these two child actors, I think it was, and one adult actor. And I think they actually left the shot where they died in the final cut of the film, but I could be totally wrong about that. She was in The Doors with Val Kilmer. That is about the band The Doors from the 1960s. Jim Morrison was their frontman. That's who Val Kilmer plays, and he's very good in that. I don't remember the movie being like exceptionally good. And of course, if you know anything about Jim Morrison or The Doors, you know that it's not going to have a happy ending, so it is what it is. And she was also in Event Horizon with Lawrence Fishburne and Sam Neill. I can't remember if Lawrence Fishburne was going by that or Larry Fishburne when that movie came out. I want to say that was a Lawrence Fishburne, but really good movie. Interesting, dark, sci-fi, very exciting movie. Really enjoyable. It's a solid one. I really like that one. For casting notes, the original screenplay to this movie was written with Kevin Costner in mind for the role of Jim Lovell because of facial similarities between Kevin Costner and the real-life Jim Lovell, but he was never brought up in serious discussions while actually casting the movie. John Travolta requested to play the role, but was politely turned down. John Cusack was offered the role of Fred Hayes, but he declined. Brad Pitt was offered the role of Jack Swigert, but refused in favor of taking his role in Seven. And as much as I love Brad Pitt, and I think he could have been great in Kevin Bacon's part, I really am happy that he went with Seven because that ended up being a big breakout lead role for Brad Pitt. Like he hadn't been in much before that as a leading man. I think maybe that was his very first, but I can't remember. For the plot synopsis, a group of astronauts on a mission to the moon suffer massive internal damage to their ship and must work with mission control at NASA to devise a plan to survive the trip and make it home. For the tagline, Houston, we have a problem. Fucking solid tagline. Love when it comes from the movie. If you have to have a tagline, that's the way you should do it. You should take something directly from the movie and choose something that really embodies the movie itself. All right, guys, let's just dive right into the plot of this motherfucking movie. So, this movie has such an amazing intro. It's the classic Universal before they switched to CGI, and the score is so epic. It's so awesome. It's magnificent, honestly. So, basically, they kind of, through voiceover, recap the previous Apollo missions, especially with the first one where they were slowly building up their program to travel to the moon. VoiceOver explains how dangerous all of the missions were and how men died in a catastrophic fire during a test run for Apollo 1 that resulted in the deaths of 3 astronauts. Of course, they touch on Apollo 11 being a landmark mission where Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin finally landed on the moon and beat Russia after having fallen behind them in the space race. They explained that the 7-year run of the program was propelled following the death of President Kennedy in late 1963. Jack Swigert, as played by Kevin Bacon, is hitting on some woman at a party as he talks about being an astronaut and what it's like. Jim Lovell shows up, as played by Tom Hanks, with some beer. For some reason, Kevin Bacon is pronouncing Gemini weirdly, like he's saying Gemini, and I don't know why, but that's apparently how they're pronouncing it, even though it's spelled like Gemini. And it's weird to me because I can't honestly believe that this happened in 1970. It just seems like by today's standards, they wouldn't have grouped these missions so close together, but obviously they were trying to accomplish something and they wanted to keep building on their progress really quickly. Ken Mattingly, as played by Gary Sinise, is talking to Fred Haise about how lucky they are to be on Jim Lovell's crew. The host of the party, who is the guy who was on Apollo 12's mission, introduces Jim, and obviously this party is kind of a celebration, and it's not only about future missions, but the Apollo 11 moon landing that is about to be broadcast on TV is what they're really there for, to watch. And obviously it's pretty exciting as a moment for all of them, not just the astronauts. It was a very big moment. But my God, this score is just so fucking perfect. Like, if you don't want to best a communist in multiple ways after watching this, I don't really understand you. Jim stands outside holding his hand up and covering the moon with his thumb to hide it from view as his wife walks outside. Marilyn Lovell is played by Kathleen Quinlan, and she is, of course, very tense about her husband's trip to the moon that's coming up. Jim sits on a lawn chair next to his wife and reflects on how far the Apollo missions have come and how they came so close with Apollo 8 and then finally achieved that goal with Apollo 11. But he is clear to say that it's just not some miracle that it all happened, but rather they decided to do it and they did everything that they needed to do to make it happen. It didn't just happen by magic. He talks to her about the terrain of the moon, and she tells him that she can't really see what he's talking about, and that he just gets really flirty after she does this to deflect and crawls over onto her lawn chair with her, and they probably held hands real hard that night, as you might imagine. It cuts to Jim talking to a group as he takes them on a tour of the launch areas at NASA in Houston. He explains that Alan Shepard will be going up on the Apollo 13 mission, and one of them asks him when Jim will be going up himself, and he says that he's not due to go up just yet, and it'll be the mission after that, most likely. They ask him why he thinks it's even necessary for them to go up to the moon now that Apollo 11 already accomplished landing on the moon and walking on the surface. He likens it to Christopher Columbus having come to America and what it would be like if no one had ever bothered to return to America after Columbus went there the first time, because like just out of it having already been done and being like, who cares? One of the tour people asks him how you go to the bathroom in space, and he is suddenly interrupted by someone who has some important news for him and tells him that something big is going on. Jim comes home very excited and explains that they have to cancel their Easter vacation that year because he is taking Alan Shepard's place on the Apollo 13 mission. And to be clear, that means that the guys who were grouped with him for the other mission that he was originally assigned to will also go on this mission. Like, they will swap because they've all been working together, and that's how that would work. Jim explains Shepard's removal from the mission as being a result of an ear infection flare-up. The mission is 6 months away at this point, and Marilyn seems slightly apprehensive about whether or not he's going to be ready within half a year, but Jim is not nervous seeming at all and is very eager to get moving. It cuts to Fred and Ken running training exercises at NASA inside of one of the modules. They're basically just remotely controlling some kind of equipment outside of where they're seated, simulating things that they will have to do on their mission while they're in space. They end up successfully completing what they were supposed to do as the alternate team switches with them, but Ken wants to stay back and work more on the exercise to just get as good as he can possibly get at it. It cuts to what appears to be another exercise, but it seems a lot more like they're actually in space this time, and it's a little confusing, but suddenly something goes wrong with their ship, and there are warning lights going off, and panicking ensues as one of the doors bursts off the ship very dramatically into space, and suddenly it turns out that Marilyn is just having a bad dream and is just now waking up from it. Jim is sitting with his son in his room explaining to him how the moon landing will work, and holy shit, his son is played by Miko Hughes, and that name may mean nothing to you, but he was the actor who played the little kid in Pet Sematary, and he was also in Kindergarten Cop, and I just fucking knew I recognized this kid. Of course, I have no idea what happened to him. Maybe he just wasn't into being an actor or he couldn't get roles once he grew up, but that's a pretty good run of movies to be in and make a name for yourself. Marilyn listens outside as Jim explains how everything will work with this moon landing, and his son asks him if he knew the astronauts in the fire that happened for the Apollo 1 testing, and Jim explains to him that he knew all of them. And he goes on to say that a lot of things went wrong with that mission, including not being able to get the hatch open when they needed to get out after the fire started. Obviously, his son is pretty fucking worried about him surviving this mission or anything going wrong, and he tries to comfort him. Jim and Marilyn are out driving in his Corvette Stingray one night, and someone pulls up next to him at a stoplight and asks him if he's Jim Lovell, and of course he says he is. And it's just weird to think that anybody would actually recognize him in real life, but I guess maybe he's been on the news or something enough to say so. The driver just says to him, "Lucky 13, suggesting that this is a bad luck mission to go on or something. Marilyn explains that their kid's schedule is very busy the following week when the launch is, and that she's considering not even going to the launch. But it's very clear that she's really just nervous about everything that's going on because it hasn't been a problem for any of the other launches when she was busy. She sounds like she just wants the whole thing to be over, and Jim is obviously a little upset with her and tells her that she's going to miss a hell of a show if she doesn't come. Jim is back at the base, and you see some guys who tell him to bring back some moon rocks for him or for them, and I still really don't understand how we can figure out what planets are made up of that we've never actually visited using just like a telescope. I don't understand how that works at all. I know the moon is not a planet, but I'm saying we've been to the moon, so we are positive what it's made up of, at least on the surface. But it's just bizarre to me that we can tell as much as we can about planets we've never actually physically visited that are so fucking far away. Jim, Ken, and Fred are attending a small closed photo shoot / press conference. An interview asks them if they're nervous about the number 13, and they say they're not, even though the number 13 does come up repeatedly in a lot of the measurements in the mission. They're very dismissive of the superstitious nonsense that comes with all of that kind of thinking, because it's very important for me to mention this, especially to the impressionable youngsters who no doubt listen to this show on a regular basis. Correlation does not equal causation, meaning that just because something that is notoriously considered to be bad luck is seen or done in advance of something bad happening, that does not mean that that bad luck thing is what actually made the bad other thing happen. And frankly, that kind of thinking is for the weak-minded who don't understand that things just happen because they happen. There are things like walking under a ladder, opening an umbrella inside, and other random nonsensical things that people in centuries past have associated with bad occurrences, but that's just a bad way of thinking and wastes a lot of time for no fucking reason. Jim explains that this mission is his last, and so he says it's a very important one to him. They ask him why he's making it his last mission, and he explains that he has the best of the best with this mission that he could possibly ask for as far as a crew and other elements, and he doesn't really think that it's likely he could ever find anything better, and so it only makes sense that he saves the best for last. Jim meets with some officials at NASA, and it turns out that they have determined that Ken Mattingly is getting ill and will likely be getting very sick while they're in space if he goes, and they think that Jack Swigert will have to replace him just for everyone's safety, but Jim seems to think that maybe Jack is not ready. Jim is obviously very opposed to this decision because he likes Ken a lot, but they kind of force his hand because they tell him that if he refuses this, they won't let him go at all. It cuts to Jack receiving the call after taking a shower at home and celebrating very enthusiastically. Then it cuts to Ken at NASA, who is obviously very upset to hear the news that he'll not be able to be a part of the mission, because even when you understand the rationale of the decision, it's hard to hide your disappointment because it's such a rare opportunity and it may never come up again. And of course, Ken doesn't want to seem resentful of Jack being able to take his place and says that Jack is more than ready to take on the task. Ken insists that even though the testing might show something, he is convinced that he is not coming down with the measles and doesn't have the measles at all. Then it cuts to more training exercises now with Jack in Ken's place, and you can tell that there's some tension between Fred and Jim as they see how Jack operates a little differently from Ken, and he seems more inexperienced. Then ultimately, one of Jack's decisions during a training exercise simulation results in a failure, and everyone is very on edge because basically it would have killed them if it would have happened in real life. So obviously, all of this is pretty unsettling, and it's meant to demonstrate the added unrest of the crew going into the mission. But Jim refuses to show any apprehension or doubt to the people that matter and reiterates that they will be ready by the end of the 2 days that they have to prepare for launch. It cuts to the night before the launch, and they're doing this whole thing where the astronauts have to stay at a distance, basically across the road from their family members who are saying their goodbyes before the next day's launch, which is this whole thing that they do because they don't want them to be exposed to any illnesses last minute that could end up jeopardizing the mission. And finally, Marilyn does show up as a surprise to Jim, and he's obviously very happy to see her there, and it makes him feel a whole lot better about everything. They begin prepping the astronauts, and they're putting the probes on their skin, like around their chest and whatnot, to measure their vitals while they're in space. It shows Marilyn at a hotel, and she accidentally drops her wedding ring in the shower drain, and she frantically tries to get it out, but she can't, and obviously it's meant to be seen as a bad omen, but again, bad things happen, and it's patently absurd to assume that dropping a ring down a shower drain might result in complications on a mission going on at the same time in space. The only thing you should assume about it is maybe you should take your ring off before you get in the shower and leave it on the counter of your vanity or something. It shows them putting the suits on the astronauts. And by the way, I've heard this, and I'm not sure it's true, but they say that they did the Apollo missions with computers that had a combined capacity of less than what a single smartphone would have today. Even now, they also say that the technology they used to complete those missions to the moon has somehow been lost as well, so it would have to be redeveloped. Like, we know how to do it, but all of the equipment that they developed over all of those years is no longer in existence, so they wouldn't have that to build off of. They make their way onto the ship, and of course the crowd is outside watching and cheering, waiting eagerly to see liftoff. We get introduced to Gene at Mission Control, played by Ed Harris, who receives a gift in a box from his wife that is a white vest with a NASA patch on it or something. I can't remember if that's actually what the patch is. To be clear, Gene is the white team director on the ground for the mission. Gene asks the various men on the ground to give him a go or no-go for launch status for the variety of components at their command. And then it shows in Florida that they are preparing for the launch and that they're ready at that command center. It shows Ken pulling up far away from the launch, but still very much in view as he has to watch on the ground instead of being on the mission. And you can just tell he's a little bitter about it, but also Gary Sinise's face seems bitter a lot of the time. And I want to be like, Lieutenant Dan, ice cream. How about you some ice cream, Lieutenant Dan? They begin a countdown from 15, and of course, everyone is excited in anticipation of the launch, and there is such an insane amount of stuff that would have to go into a launch like this. And what I find crazy is how much of space missions are based on not actual fuel propulsion, but rather on momentum while in space to get to where they're going. Obviously, everyone is very emotional as the rocket successfully takes off, and every readout on the gauges of the ship appears to be perfectly fine. Once the jet makes its way out of our atmosphere, it dispatches the rear portion of the rocket that was used for all of that propulsion initially. They suddenly get some kind of warning light for a malfunction in engine 5, but they explain that because the other engines are fine, it's not a huge problem unless they lose another one. Of course, Jim casually mentions that they just had their glitch for this mission, and he figures that they're out of the woods. And I haven't watched this in a while, but I think that was probably all the conflict to expect for this entire film. But it's like, just kidding, because Jim is not aware that this movie is over 2 hours long and we're less than 45 minutes in. And I feel like something else probably is going to happen in terms of setbacks. But also, it is possible that this is one of those boring space movies where nothing seems to happen for large stretches of time, like in 2001 A Space Odyssey. And God, I fucking hate 2001 A Space Odyssey. Just let me be clear about that. That movie starts off with this weird footage of gorillas or something, and I'm sure it's a commentary or something on society or what the hell ever. But 2001 is such a slow fucking movie for me. And when I've tried to explain that to people who are big Stanley Kubrick fans or people who really buy into it just being one of the greatest all-time movies, and I'm not saying that nothing of circumstance happens at all in the movie, but so much of it is strictly visual and doesn't drive the plot at all, and you're just watching a really cool shot of nothing happening. And I've legitimately had people argue against me saying that movies don't have to be entertaining or exciting to be good. And to that I say, you can keep your boring fucking movies and enjoy them all you want, but I'll pass hard on that. You can have cool visuals and remain interesting at the same time. Marilyn talks to one of her friends after the launch and basically explains that the stress does not go away for her until they land back on the aircraft carrier on Earth. On the ship, Fred is experiencing a bit of motion sickness or something as he enters into the weightlessness of space and he starts vomiting. And I really have to commend them for doing the zero gravity effects well, because I have no idea how they didn't end up looking like dog shit. You're gonna have to forgive me because I don't know the names of all of these things, the different ships or different parts of the ship, the modules, but basically they break off yet another piece of their ship deliberately as part of their process. And I'm so glad I'm not an aerospace engineer, because I have legitimately no idea how they figured out how to do these missions successfully or what the actual steps are and what the reasoning is for each of them. They have to dock with some other piece, and there's a lot of tension as Jack has to maneuver into its docking position. Jim suggests that he and Jack will eat, leaving Fred out because of the vomiting, but Fred insists that he will eat because he's also hungry. He eloquently explains that he could eat the ass out of a dead rhinoceros. Such lovely language. Then they also show them ejecting what I guess is supposed to be their piss into space and remark about what a beautiful sight it is. And I'm like, whoa, PG rated movie. Let's cool it with the language and subject matter. There are little fucking kids watching this shit. I mean, fuck. Jim takes video of himself that is being broadcasted on TV on Earth live. They demonstrate the lack of gravity, and instead of playing the theme to the movie 2001 A Space Odyssey, Fred opts to play Norman Greenbaum's Spirit in the Sky on a portable tape player instead for comedic effect. Jack begins explaining that if anyone from the IRS is watching, he forgot to file his 1040 return. He meant to do it that day before they launched. And Clint Howard's character back on Earth at Houston's command center, whose name I originally thought was inconsequential, but I'll tell you what it is later, mentions that they will jump on him for not doing his taxes and that it's no joke. Jim continues his broadcast and explains to the viewers how things work and why things are designed the way they are. Fred plays a little prank on them by making them think something is wrong as he activates some mechanism that makes a loud noise that they weren't expecting. And it's like, hey, Fred, read the fucking room, all right? Maybe don't do stuff like that. Things are already pretty tense traveling in space. The smallest thing that goes wrong could be catastrophic. So they run through basic procedures that they refer to as housekeeping procedures, and we get a lot of cool shots viewing the ship from outer space as Jack routinely does what Mission Control tells him to do, and he stirs the oxygen tanks, and suddenly we see through a pretty cool effect shot a malfunction within that mechanism that results in several faults and errors on the ship, and it clearly like sparks and causes some problem. The crew suddenly has to snap into action and communicate the situation to the ground. Jim, of course, says the famous line, "Houston, we have a problem," and you're like, oh shit, I really thought this was just a nice art picture and I was only here for those visuals. And they really pulled the rug out from under me, honestly. It basically causes a chain reaction that results in several faults and issues on the ship, and they are desperately trying to figure out what they need to do. Their ship is going a bit haywire in space as a result as well, and it's not able to remain stable as it travels, like the thrusters are going haywire. Jim looks out the window and sees that they are venting something into space, some sort of gas, and he explains this all to Houston. The three astronauts look at their gauges, and Jim ascertains that it must be their oxygen. Everyone in Houston is in stunned silence before finally acknowledging the transmission from Jim, and they all snap into action trying to figure out what the hell to do. Gene explains to Mission Control that he wants everyone to get a hold of anyone that might be able to help with problem solving on this issue. Obviously, on the ship, the astronauts are getting increasingly worried because they don't think that they're going to have power much longer. And by the way, Clint Howard's character name is Cy Liebergo because he has a much bigger part in this than I actually remembered originally. He explains that his best idea would be to shut off what he needs to in order to isolate the leak and stop the bleeding of losing the oxygen. Of course, Gene is frustrated by this idea because if they do this, they can't turn it back on, and if they proceed, they won't be able to land on the moon. But Cy explains that at this point, it's their only option, and obviously, it's far more important that they figure out what they need to do to be able to get these guys back to Earth than it is to worry about landing on the moon at this point. Of course, Gene begrudgingly agrees with this despite all of the obvious frustrations he has, and he tells his team to proceed with that plan. When they transmit this plan to the astronauts, Jim clarifies that they actually want him to shut off the valves in question because obviously Jim knows what a major thing that would be to do. After he acknowledges the transmission, Jim explains to Fred and Jack that they just lost the moon. And Jack also points out that if this plan doesn't work, they won't have enough fuel to even get back home. But once they shut off the valves that they need to, they look at their gauges and realize that the O2 readout is still falling and the plan did not work. Jim instructs them to snap into action and shut down all of their power before the batteries die on them. Of course, Houston is also devastated and they try and give Jim instructions, most of which he has already started doing. Houston informs Jim that they have less than 15 minutes left of life support capacity in the ship, and of course, Jim relays this to Fred and Jack. Jack explains to Houston that he has completed the steps that he needs to complete before shutting down, but Jim tells him that he needs his readouts before he shuts everything down. Jim struggles to write down all of these measurements that Jack gives him. He also asks Houston to record all of the measurements and make sure that his math is correct, and they all verify his numbers and they tell him to proceed. It cuts to Ken bitterly sitting at home watching a late night talk show where the host is explaining that Jack Swigert is the first bachelor astronaut on a trip to space. I think this is Dick Cavett. I can't remember. I've seen Dick Cavett, and it's basically the only person I think it could be, but I'm not sure. In frustration, Ken opts to just shut off the TV without looking just as the emergency broadcast comes on about the issues with the mission. It cuts to Marilyn watching the broadcast and obviously panicking because they're trying to minimize the potential concerns with the mission, despite her recognizing that there are a lot of problems that are obviously more concerning than the broadcaster is making it seem like they are. As Jim's intensity is running high, he is angrily responding to instructions from Houston about what to do because he's obviously very frustrated, and the fact that nothing is quite as easy as they act like it should be for him to complete, and he's saying it all because he doesn't know they can hear him talking. So they point out that Jim's microphone is on without him realizing it, and he has been saying a lot of stuff that's super unprofessional. Marilyn has to comfort their son about what's going on with the mission, and it cuts back to Jim having to manually fly while their thrusters are going haywire. They finally have to shut off everything as they nervously continue traveling, and Jack comes back to Fred and Jim. Gene gathers all of his men in a room to discuss their new mission, which is to bring their guys home. He draws a diagram on the chalkboard that explains that the ship is almost to the moon, and their initial theory is that they should use gravity to slingshot the ship around the moon. But one of them suggests that with all three of them on board, they cannot actually manage this from a physics perspective. Gene explains that the only engine that they've got on board with enough power to complete a direct abort instead instead of using the slingshot method is one that Jim has already indicated may have been damaged, so they have to rule it out. Now, they keep referring to the LEM, LEM, which actually means Lunar Excursion Module. They explain that they will have to use its power to thrust them around the moon, but the men in the room who designed the LEM explained that it was not made to do anything other than land on the moon, so they can't really make any promises beyond that. Gene frustratedly points out that they are not planning to land on the moon and that they cannot worry about what things were intended to be used for originally because they have to improvise most of what they do now, so maybe they should just shut the hell up. We reached day 4, and some of the higher ups at Mission Control suggest that it might be reasonable to give up and let the 3 astronauts perish, since it seems like such a likely possibility at this point, no matter what they try, but Gene adamantly refuses to do that. As the 3 astronauts circle behind the moon, they all look at it from an angle and proximity that most of them have never seen it from before. Of course, the news broadcast on the ground sends Jim's wife Marilyn into complete hysterics because everything is so anxiety inducing given how dire the circumstances are. There's a little bit of tension between the 3 astronauts as Jack and Fred have never seen the moon like this, but Jim has on previous missions. Jim looks at the moon out of a different window and has a bit of a fantasy sequence where he lives out this dream of walking on the moon, a dream that he now knows will likely never come true. He turns to Fred and Jack and asks them what their intentions are and explains that he would very much like to get home. Back in the boardroom with Gene and the other experts, they now have ascertained that they can only keep traveling for another 45 hours, but one man named John stands up and points out that they need to do everything they can to conserve power because if they don't shut things off now, if they continue as they have, they will likely only last about 15 hours more. So he suggests that they need to reduce everything down to extreme power saving mode and turn off basically all of the instruments that they can. So basically just shut off Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, or maybe straight up switch it into airplane mode and just tough it out like the pioneers used to do. And he explains that every second they waste debating about this objective fact is time that they don't have. And the guy says, John just says that he's been looking at all of this data for the past hour and it's undeniable. Gene finally breaks down and realizes that John is right, and he says that as soon as they finish running the engines, they will power everything down that they can. Gene tasks his team with having them list every single usable item that is on the ship, then tells them to talk to the guys on the assembly line who actually built the parts and know everything about them. And he basically wants them to figure out what they can use those items for to help get these guys back to Earth. Gene then declares failure is not an option. And honestly, I have heard that phrase so many times in my life now, and I honestly couldn't have told you before today to save my life where it originated because it's so commonplace, but apparently it was in this movie. A man comes to Ken's apartment to get him out of bed because Ken is still unaware of the situation and they need his help to land the ship. They bring Ken back to the base and fill him in on more of the details. But the same guy, John, who pointed out the power issues, who I mentioned, is briefing Ken on what they know and don't know and what the limitations are that they have. The two of them try and determine a plan of action, and Ken is determined to run simulations like they were doing in training and recreate the setup that they have in space right now with all of the same limitations to determine what can actually be done. Jim follows Houston's instructions and shuts off almost all of the electrical devices on board the ship. Some of the experts come to Gene to explain to him that they have a CO2 filter issue now as well because nothing on the ship was designed to support 3 men continuously for this long. And basically, if they use as much as they will at the rate they have been using it at the moment, they will begin to have severe health issues and blackouts and all sorts of other things as a result of CO2 poisoning. Cy and his group proceed with gathering all of the existing components on the ship and empty it onto a giant boardroom table in order to try and figure out what they can use. Suddenly, the press is at the Lovell house, and Marilyn is frustrated that they didn't give a shit about this mission at all originally, but now they suddenly are very interested with all of the drama occurring. On board the ship, Fred is getting increasingly ill, and with all of the other major instruments turned off, it's also getting very cold in there. Like they can see their breath hanging in the air. Jim tells them that he doesn't look good and that there's some aspirin in the medical kit, but Fred clarifies that he's already taken the aspirin and that he's going to be fine. Then he reveals that his wife getting pregnant was not actually a planned pregnancy, but then Fred explains that it hurts when he urinates and jokes that he thinks Jack gave him the clap, which is slang for this sexually transmitted disease, gonorrhea, which according to Google likely comes from the French word clapier, meaning rabbit hut or brothel, linking the disease to places of prostitution, or from the Old English clappen, meaning to beat or throb, describing painful symptoms like burning or throbbing in the groin. Another theory suggests it relates to an early treatment involving mercury injections that made a clapping sound. And you know what? I'm just not going to dive into all of those other things and what they mean for the sake of focus on this movie. Suddenly, Jack interrupts them to tell them he has been going over the numbers, and based on his calculations, they had them burn the engines too long, and now he believes that they will overshoot the Earth with their current trajectory. But he also causes a panic as he explains that he doesn't think that Houston would actually tell them if they've determined a mistake and the calculations was even made. Jim very dismissively tells Jack that his concerns are noted, and we get this very tense argument between the three of them. Obviously, they're all concerned for their well-being, and they're getting very worried and letting that get the better of them, and it's coming out in anger. Finally, Houston comes over the radio to tell them that they need to check their CO2 readings, which they confirm have gotten dangerously near the level of 15, which carried all of those health risks. And they have to explain to the astronauts that they are working on a procedure for them to follow to resolve the issue with their CO2 levels. Cy and his team have assembled some kind of device and have to walk the three astronauts through assembling it themselves, which honestly terrifies me because I usually have to watch a YouTube video like 6 or 7 times through to learn how to do anything new, and I usually jump back several times during those viewings. So I can't imagine how difficult this would be, just having one guy explaining it and having to do it step by step. The story comes out to the press that there is too much CO2 in the cabin, and obviously this creates a lot more panicked reactions. As they're assembling this device based on NASA's instructions, Fred accidentally rips one of the plastic bags, but luckily they have a spare. The families gather watching the broadcast, and they're explaining how it's not possible to accomplish a rescue mission in space, and at the press conference it's made clear that this is the most serious situation they've ever faced on a manned flight to space. They finally get the CO2 device set up, and they watch with bated breath as they wait to see if the level will go down, and it finally does, much to their relief. Houston is very relieved, but they are obviously not even out of the woods with anything else yet, and Ken is still running simulations to try and figure out what they can do to do what they need to do while staying under a certain level of power. Everyone on the ground who is not a big piece of shit is refusing to rest, knowing that the astronauts are also not getting a chance to rest. Marilyn and her kids have to go see Jim's mother to break the news to her what the situation is, and of course, everyone is very much on edge, especially the kids. And Jim's mother asks the younger daughter, her granddaughter, if she's scared, and her granddaughter nods. And the grandmother just tells her not to worry, and she says that if they could get a washing machine to fly, her Jimmy could land it. And my God, I got particularly emotional during this scene, but I won't really get into why. It was just very fucking heart-wrenching. One of the other things, as all of this is going on the ship, is that the tape player Fred was using earlier is losing batteries and playing slower and slower until it does eventually die while it still floats around the ship. And today's lesson on the history of technology is tape players. When I was a kid, I had something called a Sony Walkman, and a lot of people, in my opinion, overpronounced Walkman as Walkman, but in my personal opinion, it should be pronounced more like its last name. Anywho, for those that don't know, the Walkman was a portable tape player with a 3.5 millimeter jack on it that was battery powered, and you could plug headphones into the jack. We didn't have Bluetooth then at all. It didn't exist as a technology. You could listen to standard cassette tapes on it, and it was great because cassette tapes don't skip like CDs or records do, so you could use it on the fly and not deal with a bunch of skipping. It was basically like an iPod or a smartphone before those existed, and it was followed by the Discman that was basically the same thing, but it played CDs, and it usually had to have anti-skip protection or you had to be very careful with it so it didn't skip. But let's get back to the excitement. So the flight surgeon insists that the three of them need to get more sleep because Fred is running a fever of 104, and Jim angrily removes the probes from his chest in protest because he's sick of the entire Western world knowing what his vitals are. This, of course, causes panic with ground control as the two others follow suit, and they no longer can tell what their status is health wise easily. But Gene explains that it's just a little medical mutiny, and he's sure that all three of them are still fine. As Jim considers eating something, he pulls a hot dog out of a wrapper, and it's frozen solid, and he bangs it against a solid surface on the ship to show it to the other two that it's frozen solid. Houston communicates to them that they have to do some corrective adjustments with their thrusters that align with Jack's findings from earlier, but clarifies that they cannot turn on their computers to do it. Jim determines that if they can keep the Earth lined up in one specific window of the ship as he views it, he just needs to know how long they need to burn the engines in order to correct and stay on the right course. Gene gets frustrated as one of the engineers explains that the process they are using to correct their trajectory has never been tried before and has a lot of potential to not work properly, but he insists that they have to do something. They proceed with 10% thrust at 39 seconds of runtime, and obviously it's a very difficult thing because they have to manually maneuver the ship without any real computer guidance. And I want to say that this movie benefits so much in that its special effects are able to bank on the fact that most people have not ever seen any of this in real life to know what it would look like or what size it would be. Gene comes back into the boardroom and congratulates the men on successfully giving them enough time to complete re-entry with their corrections, but he needs them to get working on their re-entry procedures with starting up the equipment. Ken gets frustrated with John as they try and determine how they can possibly attempt re-entry without using so many of the components that they would usually use. The news plays an old interview with Jim where he's explaining about some of the issues that he has run into in his career, especially as a pilot, and the basic sentiment from him is that sometimes bad things happen and you just never know how things will work out, and you have to roll with the punches and improvise and think on the fly. Back on the ship, Jim explains that they're all very eager to hear what the re-entry procedure is and that they don't want to have to figure everything out last second up there. But Houston tries to assure him that they will be getting the procedure to him very soon. Ken ends up having a bit of a revelation as he works with John. He determines that they can reverse the power on one of their units to give them the amount of amps that they need to complete their startups. Then, when they run the test on it, as tensions are running high, they watch the gauge for the electricity and they are just under their limits, and they believe that they have a good plan, and they bring it back to Gene. So Ken comes to the command center and puts on a headset so he can communicate directly with the ship and give them directions on what they need to do. Jim asks Ken if he actually has the measles, but Ken confirms that he does not. And then Ken starts walking Jack through the procedures that they've developed. They also determined that because they never stopped at the moon, their weights have to be corrected to account for the lack of hundreds of pounds of moon rocks that they were supposed to collect. So they have to shift a bunch of stuff that they have in the ships around and be in the right place so the weight ends up being right. Obviously, the excitement comes to a fever pitch as we see if they can successfully get into the right trajectory to be able to make re-entry. There's a moment where they jettison a portion of their aircraft that they no longer need, and they determine that the damage is much more significant than they expected, looking at it from the outside. And it's really weird because I think the strangest thing I noticed in almost every movie about astronauts is that I've ever seen is that I always get the impression that these ships are so small. But then inside, the ships look like they have all sorts of space to move around in. But I also think that has a lot to do with the way they shoot the footage, because I guarantee it's far more claustrophobic than it actually actually seems. Jim notices that Fred's condition is worsening and he even holds him a little bit to try and warm him up because he's so cold, and he just asks him if he can make it a little while longer. Jim clears the fog from a window and looks out across the curvature of the earth that is for some reason showing some sort of round shape, despite so many intelligent experts on the internet arguing that it is completely flat, and those people just know lots of stuff, guys. At one point, Jim accidentally gets seated in the pilot's chair and then corrects himself and allows Jack to take over. Jack explains that he covered one of the controls with a little sign that said no, so that he didn't accidentally cut loose the module while Jim and Fred were still in it. And honestly, no matter how many of these movies that I see, I don't think I will ever fully understand the process that these spaceships have to use to re-enter our atmosphere. Like, not only do they seemingly just dump a lot of equipment and let it float off into space, but also it seems like so much of what they do is based solely on momentum. Gene is advised of an issue that there is nothing they can do about and opts not to tell the astronauts about it for obvious reasons. Like, he doesn't want to just create panic and maybe alter how they approach things because of that. Then, as one of the higher ups speculates that this could be one of NASA's biggest catastrophes, Gene corrects him by saying that he believes this will be their finest hour. And I'd really like to know if that exchange actually happened, because it kind of seems like it might have just been made up for this movie, and that's a real bummer because it's a good scene. As they're coming through the atmosphere, they have to cut radio contact for 3 minutes. That 3 minutes is what it takes to basically get into the atmosphere. The intense heat causes immense condensation within the ship, and water is dripping fucking everywhere as everyone waits in anticipation on the ground. Everyone continues watching the TV broadcast, waiting to see what will happen and if it will be a success. The anticipation and tension are undeniable as everyone waits for the radio blackout to stop, and as Houston attempts to reach the ship, the first thing they see are the parachutes opening, and Jim acknowledges their transmission to confirm they are okay and everyone survived. Everyone is just overjoyed by the relief that they feel, knowing that everyone's fine. Their little pod lands on the ocean surface, and the pod is retrieved by a rescue team in helicopters, probably military or whatever rescue workers. Everyone is elated as they exit the pod and are lifted out. The astronauts come back to be received by their families. In voiceover narration, Tom Hanks as Jim explains that their mission was considered a successful failure. It was later determined that a damaged coil in their oxygen tanks caused an explosion when they initiated their cryostir, a defect that would have been present years before any of them were even selected for the mission. He explains that Fred was due to be a part of Apollo 18 before the mission was canceled due to budget cuts, and he never flew in space again. He says Jack left the astronaut corps and successfully ran for Congress in Colorado, but died of cancer before he actually took office. Ken Mattingly orbited the moon as command module pilot of Apollo 16 and flew the space shuttle, never having gotten the measles at all. Gene Kranz retired shortly before the movie was made, along with several others who left for other things. Jim explains that the 7 days of Apollo 13 were his last in space. He watched other men walk on the moon and return safely, all from either mission control or from the confines of his own home. He explains that he sometimes still looks back and thinks of all of these events and wonders if and when we will ever go to the moon again, and we roll credits. Okay, so before we get to true trivia, because this is a true story, I want to first list some of the things that were kind of made up for the movie or were different in the movie compared to what actually happened in real life. In the film, Lovell tells his wife he was given command of Apollo 13 instead of 14 because original commander Alan Shepard's ear infection was flaring up again. In fact, Shepard had no ear infection. He had been grounded since 1963 by Meniere's disease. This was surgically corrected 4 years later, and he was returned to flight duty in May of 1969. Manned Spacecraft Center Management felt he needed more training time for a lunar mission. The film portrays the Saturn V launch vehicle being rolled out to the launch pad 2 days before launch, but in reality, the launch vehicle was rolled out on the mobile launcher using the crawler transporter 2 months before the actual launch date. The film depicts the crew hearing a bang shortly after Swigert follows directions from Mission Control to stir the oxygen and hydrogen tanks. In reality, the crew heard the bang 95 seconds later. The film depicts Cy Liebergo suggesting that the oxygen leak was in one or two of Odyssey's fuel cells, and the order to shut them down was passed up to the crew, forcing abort of the lunar landing mission. In reality, Mission Control did not order the shutdown. Hayes found the cells were already dead because of starvation due to the damage to the oxygen system. The film depicts Swigert and Hayes arguing about who was at fault. The show The Real Story, Apollo 13, broadcast on the Smithsonian Channel, includes Hayes stating that no such argument took place and that there was no way anyone could have foreseen that stirring the tank would cause problems. The dialogue between ground control and astronauts was taken nearly verbatim from transcripts and recordings, with the exception of one of the taglines of the film, "Houston, we have a problem." According to the audio of the air-to-ground communications, the actual words uttered by Swigert were, "Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here." Ground control responded by saying, "This is Houston, say again, please." And then Jim Lovell then repeated, "Houston, we've had a problem." In the film, flight director Gene Kranz and his white team are portrayed as managing all of the essential parts of the flight from liftoff to landing. Consequently, the actual role of the other flight directors and teams, especially Glenn Lunney and his black team, were neglected. In fact, it was flight director Lunney and his black team who got Apollo 13 through the most critical period and the hours immediately after the explosion, including the mid-course correction that sent Apollo 13 on a free return trajectory around the moon and back to Earth. In the film, Mattingly plays a key role in solving a power consumption problem that Apollo 13 faced as it approached re-entry. Lovell points out in his commentary that this was actually a composite of several astronauts and engineers, including Charles Duke, whose Rebella led to Mattingly's grounding, all of whom worked together to solve that problem. When Swigert is getting ready to dock with the LM, the lunar module, I believe, a concerned NASA technician says, "If Swigert doesn't dock this thing, we don't have a mission." Lovell and Hayes also seem worried. In his DVD commentary, the real Jim Lovell says that if Swigert had been unable to dock with the LM, he or Hayes could have done it themselves. He also says that Swigert was a well-trained command module pilot, and no one was really worried about whether or not he was up to the job, but he admitted that it made a nice subplot for the film. What the astronauts were really worried about, Lovell says, was the expected rendezvous between the lunar module and the command module after Lovell and Hayes left the surface of the moon. A scene set the night before the launch, showing the astronauts' family members saying their goodbyes while separated by a road to reduce the possibility of any last-minute transmission of disease, depicted a tradition that did not begin until the Space Shuttle program. The film depicts Marilyn Lovell accidentally dropping her wedding ring down a shower drain. According to Jim Lovell, this did occur, but the drain trap caught the ring and his wife was able to retrieve it. Lovell has also confirmed that the scene in which his wife had a nightmare about him being sucked through an open door of a spacecraft into outer space also occurred, though he believes the nightmare was prompted by her seeing a scene in Marooned, a 1969 film that they saw 3 months before Apollo 13 launched. All right, so on to trivia. In a commentary track, Marilyn Lovell comments that Tom Hanks exactly portrays Jim Lovell's mannerisms and style of movement. In some scenes where the Earth can be seen from the windows of Apollo 13, it is one of the photos taken by Jim Lovell and Bill Anders on the Apollo 8 mission. At around 2 hours and 10 minutes in, Jim Lovell wore his old Captain Navy captain's uniform in the scene where he greets the astronauts aboard the USS Iwo Jima. When Ron Howard asked Lovell if he'd like to be in the film as the ship's admiral, Lovell agreed but pointed out, "I retired as a captain I will be." Bill Paxton, Tom Hanks, and Kevin Bacon were all very proud of the fact that they weren't sick on the so-called vomit comet, which is the plane used to simulate zero gravity, but the cameramen weren't actually so lucky. When the real Jim Lovell saw the film, he found the CGI work so convincing that he firmly believed that the filmmakers had uncovered some hitherto unseen NASA footage. Boy, hitherto is not a word I come across very often. The spacesuits cost $30,000 each. Ron Howard anticipated difficulty in portraying weightlessness in a realistic manner. He discussed this with Steven Spielberg, who suggested using a KC-135 airplane, which can be flown in such a way to create about 23 seconds of weightlessness, a method NASA has always used to train its astronauts for spaceflight. Howard obtained NASA's permission and assistance in filming in the realistic conditions aboard multiple KC-135 flights. Set designers looked through the Lovells' old family photographs to recreate their house from 1969. The real Apollo 13 capsule was restored and is on display at the Kansas Cosmosphere in Hutchinson, Kansas. At around 1 hour and 24 minutes in, Hayes jokingly accuses Swigert of giving him the clap by sharing relief tubes. Fred Hayes' illness was in fact related to the relief tubes. It was a urinary tract infection caused by his continual wearing of the condom-like sleeve needed to use the spacecraft's waste disposal system. All right, so IMDb nugget. This is so dumb. At around 16 minutes in, the license plate on Jim Lovell's red Chevy Corvette Stingray is Texas BKS 426. That's it. No like, hey, that was a reference to this other thing. It's just telling us what a license plate number is in a movie and what state it's from. Neato. All right, on to info and ratings. Opening weekend, 25.4 million. Worldwide gross, 355.8 million. IMDb rating, 7.7. Letterboxd rating, 3.8. Rotten Tomato Critics score, 94%. Rotten Tomato Audience score, 87%. Personal rating, 5 out of 5 stars. Praise for this movie. I really adore the real-life tension this movie brings and conveys so well throughout, even though they did have to stretch the truth here and there to make it work better as a movie. The performances by the lead and supporting cast members is legitimately phenomenal and believable. I also love the portrayal of the problem solving and the demonstration of what difficult tasks faced the different teams throughout, both on Earth and on the ship. For criticism, Ron Howard, I'm still upset at you about that whole fucking Grinch movie. Honestly, I fucking hated the Jim Carrey Grinch, and I know a lot of kids in my generation loved it and still love it. I think it's awful, and it's like a 30-minute cartoon, dude. Why did you have to make it into like an hour and 45-minute long movie? I just don't get it. All right, everyone, thank you for stopping by. I do appreciate it. Have a good rest of your day. Bye now.
I'm here to welcome you to Brandon at Random Reviews. No, nothing, we're not you.